He seems to be an expert at rapping Steve Witkoff, who is just starstruck by Trump. I strongly recommend you all look at this interview between Witkoff and Tucker Carlson in March, which really hasn't worn well. And you see Witkoff just starstruck by the fact that Putin allowed him to meet him.
Yeah.
It's just pathetic.
Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, has arrived in Russia. He spent the last weeks trying and failing to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza and Israel, and few expect a better outcome for Russia and Ukraine. Unless President Putin agrees to a ceasefire by Friday, President Trump says he will impose secondary sanctions of 100% tariffs against Moscow's remaining trade partners. What hope for progress from Witkoff's talks? Leigh Turner is former British ambassador to Ukraine and author of Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. So a good man to speak to this morning. Leigh, good morning to you.
Morning, Stig.
I guess the real question is, are we reaching an important moment where Trump acts to force Putin's hand, or will Trump always chicken out?
Well, as always with President Trump, who is nothing if not mercurial, it's very obscure what's going on here. As you say, there's been lots of suggestions that Trump is at last going to get tough with President Putin as Moscow continues this massive bombardment of Ukrainian civilian targets. There were over 6,000 long-range drone attacks in July, which is 14 times the level of a year ago. Just imagine that. And at last, Trump has provided some more advanced defensive weapons to Ukraine. He's also talked about these all-important secondary sanctions, which basically mean stopping other countries buying Russian oil so in order to finance Russia's war, unless there is a peace deal by the 8th of August. So the question is, has Trump really recognized that Putin is just stringing him along? And the precedents honestly aren't good, because Trump has repeatedly expressed frustration with Putin and promised sanctions. He did it on the 17th of March. He did it on the 30th of March. He did it in April after the Pope's funeral. Each time, nothing happens. Putin makes a few vague statements or promises, and the problem goes away. So it seems that Putin is an expert at hoodwinking Trump. He seems to be an expert at rapping Steve Witkoff, who is just starstruck by Trump. I strongly recommend you all look at this interview between Witkoff and Tucker Carlson in March, which really hasn't worn well. And you see Witkoff just starstruck by the fact that Putin allowed him to meet him. Yeah. It's just pathetic. So
is that the fear then? Do you think that Witkoff, the man, I mean, a lot of these things are about the behaviour of men and women in senior roles. You know, Trump and Putin's personalities are very important in this debate. Yeah. I guess Witkoff's competence and ability is actually an important factor in all of this.
It's a very important factor, and Witkoff isn't stupid. He is a real estate developer. He plays golf with Trump. He's a very wealthy man, so he regards himself as being a very successful negotiator, just as President Trump does. But when he has been to see Putin, he comes back spouting verbatim Russian arguments. I mean, back in March, he repeated Russian claims that Ukraine was a false country and asked when the world would recognize that occupied Ukrainian territory was Russian. Yet he couldn't even name the 5 regions of Ukraine that Russia had occupied. And he's given credibility to these fake referendums held by Russia in those occupied regions. So it's very disturbing. And at the same time, we have President Trump himself, who, as I said, fancies himself as a great deal maker, saying he wants a deal where people stop getting killed. Well, of course we want to stop people getting killed. But last time that the US had some kind of peace deal on offer, it basically gave Russia everything it wanted. We had the idea that Russia would be able to stop the invasion at its present front line. We had suggestions that the US was going to formally recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea, which Russia occupied in 2014. And this would really be a total Russian victory. Absolute concessions by Ukraine, nothing from Russia. And all of this really puts the future of world peace on the table and would store up immense problems for the future for all of us.
And the problem we've got here is that if there really is this question of you need a deal, some sort of peace deal or move towards a peace deal by Friday, there's no real version of events where that can be a nuanced, thoughtful deal that will compel Russia to withdraw, will give Ukraine some of the conditions that it would want for its protection in the future. Those things seem so far away that the notion of this happening by Friday is almost impossible, actually. So the best that we can hope for is some sort of gesture by Putin, which, as you've been explaining, by its very nature, is likely to be illusory.
We see this again and again, that Putin makes a vague statement and a deadline which previously has been in place just slips away. I liked your reference to Douglas Adams and the sound of deadlines swooshing by. And there isn't really a landing zone of anything which would be acceptable to Putin and something that would be acceptable to the Ukrainian people and President Zelensky, because Zelensky doesn't want to reward Russia for invading his country, and President Putin can't afford to withdraw his troops or he'll be toast. And meanwhile, the rest of us, if Russia wins this war, which is what Trump's deal would be likely to imply, first of all, Russia will attack Ukraine again. We saw that after the so-called deal in 2014. Secondly, Russia might attack some other neighbors. Look at Kazakhstan, which is 4 times the size of Ukraine, full of Russian speakers and has a huge border with Russia. And then every other country in the world that fancies attacking its neighbor would have a go. And finally, Stig, if you're not depressed enough already, if you look at that Witkoff interview back in March, you'll see that the Americans are rightly very concerned about the risk of a nuclear war. And the problem is that if you interpret that as meaning Russia has to be given whatever it wants because it has nuclear weapons and it's too dangerous to arm Ukraine, or it's too dangerous to help Ukraine to win this war, or at least not to lose it, then the key message that is being broadcast to the world is, unless you, country X, get nuclear weapons, your nuclear-armed neighbor can do whatever the hell they want. And that's a really frightening message, because it means every country is going to want to get nuclear weapons if Russia wins its war against Ukraine.
You've given us, as you say, a very downbeat system here. What's the best possible scenario here? Best case scenario, I guess. Would it be that Trump at least maintains at some stage the ability to send weapons or to sell weapons to Europe for Ukraine, and has some regard in whatever he says after this for Ukrainian sovereignty? Is that as good as it gets, do you think?
Yes, I think the sovereignty issue is absolutely fundamental. If the US were prepared to recognize that a single square inch of Ukraine was under Russian sovereignty, that would set alarm bells ringing around the world. The hope is that President Trump at some point will realize that Putin is treating him like a fool and will get tough with Moscow. It's not happened yet in more than 6 months of Trump's presidency. There are plenty of things that the US could do. One would be to enhance sanctions. So that would mean that countries that were importing Russian oil would be sanctioned for doing so. There happens to be an oil glut at the moment, so that would be easy to do. Another thing they could do is to put sanctions on Russia's shadow fleet. This is their uninsured, dangerous, leaky boats that are transporting Russian oil around the world. And finally, they could put secondary sanctions on banks and oil refineries in other countries that facilitate the trade in Russian oil. All of these things would help to put pressure on Putin to reach a meaningful peace deal, and not one that just means Russia getting everything it wants.
So we'll see if that happens, but at least we now know the terms of engagement from this. Really interesting stuff, Leigh. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dick.
That's Leigh Turner, their former British ambassador to Ukraine and author of Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties, really explaining the power dynamic there. And, I think, why would Witkoff, a real estate mogul, be good at negotiating the fate of nations?
Well, the other thing that we've had pointed out to us on this programme over the last couple of weeks is that usually, and this is the point that was being made there by Leigh Turner, in order for diplomacy to be successful, you'd have a team of people who would go over, you would start the negotiations, you would stand back, you wouldn't be overawed by the situation, and you certainly wouldn't publicly, as Steve Witkoff has done, sort of be impressed that somebody wants to meet you, because that's effectively showing your hand and putting yourself in your place before you even got through the door. That isn't what happens here. No. And Steve Witkoff heading over there without, as far as we know, a team of Sherpas going over beforehand. There's no real understanding of what the scope of a deal or agreement is. There's just this kind of vague deadline, the end of the week, which allows Russia to fill in the blanks itself, which is we're starting to see in some of the newspapers today too. And for Ukraine's part, as Catherine Philp was telling us earlier this morning, she's in Ukraine at the moment, they're essentially sitting back and watching it all happen and just hoping that the weapons deliveries keep on coming, which is America selling weapons to Europe to then pass on to Ukraine.
Which might be as good as it gets for them as well.
Because, and it may well be, yeah.
Because I do keep coming back to this thing we've discussed before, Kate, this idea of the attention deficit disorder president, who basically, he lives his life on social media schedules and trying to solve a huge diplomatic and land-based geopolitical problem like Ukraine, Russia, by saying, here's a deadline, here's a deadline, here's a deadline, is never going to work. The level of nuance needed to get something that is better than nothing.
Well, it misunderstands Putin's motivation. And anybody who's read anything that he has written about his motivations for what's going on in Ukraine will understand that this is basically his reason for existing. And it's very unlikely he's going to be swayed from that by a deadline on Friday.
We could be surprised.
We might be wrong.
We're going to report it as it happens. Witkoff is in Moscow now. On this station, we have all the experts ready to go to discuss what is going on. So we'll give you all the insight as we can fathom it, but not necessarily with a full degree of optimism yet. But it may change. Who knows where we'll be on Friday.